So Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Wisconsin in 1867, and he died in 1959. So he lived to be almost 92 years old. He was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin. His parents were William Carey Wright and Anna Lloyd Jones. Anna Lloyd Jones was a member of the Lloyd Jones family. They had land up in Wisconsin, outside of it. That's where Taliesin is now. He moved with his family to Madison when he was 12, and when he was 18, he went to the University of Wisconsin, did one semester, and worked for the dean without having finished high school. He never finished college, and he moved to Chicago in 1887 to become an architect. He came here and got a job with Silsby, who was an architect who'd done work for his uncle, who was a famous Unitarian minister in Chicago. He married Catherine Tobin, and he moved to Oak Park, where they raised 5 children. So this is Wright when he was a young boy, about 9 years old. And about that time, his mother went to the World's Fair in Philadelphia, and she saw a presentation by Frederick Froebel on the Froebel blocks, and it was a learning system for children to learn how to play first. So Frederick Froebel was the person who invented kindergarten. And I've muted everybody, so if you have a question, just put it in the chat. Frederick Froebel invented kindergarten. Prior to his invention of kindergarten, children in many areas would go to work when they were very little, unless they were from a wealthy family. And he felt that children needed to learn through play. So he had a series of what he called the gifts. And Wright's mother purchased those and brought them back and used them with young Frank Lloyd Wright. And there are stories that she would put, when he was a baby, she put pictures of cathedrals, famous cathedrals, on his wall, but above his crib, because he was going to be a famous architect. Is that really true? We're not sure, because Wright wrote about that. You know, it sounds a bit fanciful. But she brought these back to him. He designed more than 1,000 structures. 532 were completed. Many of them are national landmarks. Some are on the UNESCO World Heritage Site as of 2 years ago, and a lot of them are open for tours. He believed that you should design in harmony with nature, and he called it organic architecture. So in his autobiography, he wrote about 5 influences on his life. And the first one was Japanese prints. So Japan had been opened up to the Western world in the mid to late 1800s, and a lot of artists and architects were greatly influenced by the simplicity of Japanese architecture and design. So a lot of architects collected Japanese prints. His first employer, Joseph Lyman Silsby, had an extensive collection of Japanese prints. And during the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, it's noted that he went numerous times to see the Japanese pavilion that was there. So this comes back, and we'll see drawings that look a lot like the Japanese prints later in his work. His next influence was Louis Sullivan. He stayed with Silsby for about 6 months, and then he went over to the firm of Adler and Sullivan. Adler and Sullivan were considered the premier commercial architects in the country, especially in Chicago. They did a series of multi-use high-rises, which was a new phenomenon. And Sullivan believed in organic architecture, using a lot of influences from nature, etc. And he started with Sullivan as a draftsman and very quickly moved up to head designer in the firm. So Sullivan saw something in young Frank Lloyd Wright. And so Wright always considered Sullivan his greatest influence. The other was music. Wright's father was a professional musician, and Wright grew up playing music, played music his whole life, and the students who went to Taliesin all had musical concerts, etc. So music was a huge part of his life. He always had pianos in every house and in multiple rooms. The next was nature. Having grown up in Spring Green, Wisconsin, or spent the summers up there with his uncles on the farm, he was really influenced by nature and the beauty in nature. And then the last influence was Frobel blocks, those blocks that his mother brought back from the Philadelphia World's Fair. And we'll have a lecture later about Frobel blocks, and I'll talk about them in a little more detail. So Wright's life was divided into 3 phases by historians after Wright was gone. The first one was called the Golden Years. Then there was a period called the Lost Years. And then the last one, I'm spacing right now on what the name was. But we're going to talk right now about the Golden Years, which took place in Oak Park, Illinois. And this is the architecture that we're going to see next Wednesday when we go on our walking tour. So here's Frank Lloyd Wright's house as it was originally built. Frank Lloyd Wright, at this time, he met a young woman at his church named Catherine Tobin, wanted to get married to her. He was only 21 years old and wanted to purchase this piece of property at the corner of Forest and Chicago Avenue in Oak Park and build a house for his young bride. So he approached Louis Sullivan and asked him if he would loan him money to build the house. And Louis Sullivan agreed to loan him $5,000. $5,000 in 1889 was a tremendous sum of money, well over $250,000 in today's dollars, beyond that. So Sullivan had 3 requirements that he pay Sullivan back, and that he only worked for Sullivan during that period of time, and that he had 5 years to pay him back. So Wright agreed to that, built this house. It is not a prairie style house, but it does have some prairie elements, such as, and we'll see this on our walk, as these windows grouped together or banded together, called a ribbon of windows. It's a very steep pitched roof. This is called a shingle style, and when we get there, you'll see the shingles on the outside. This was popular in English, New England vacation architecture on the ocean, and Joseph Lyman Silsbee did a lot of shingle style houses. So this was influenced by Silsbee. Here is the side of the house. So we saw the view from the front over here before, and now we're looking at the side where his home and studio is. Wright lived here for 20 years, and he did 2 major additions onto the house, one being the playroom and conversion of other rooms, and the other being adding the studio to his house. So this is the studio entrance. Looks very different from the house that we saw on the previous one. If you came up here, you know that you weren't at the house. It doesn't look like a house entrance. So this is the dining room in the house. This is part of the first renovation that he did in 1893. And this was the former kitchen, and he added a new kitchen on the back, added a playroom, which we'll see in a minute. And he turned the kitchen into this formal dining room. The other dining room became a study. So what he did here was he created a whole environment. This room was designed with this table and chairs. So the chairs are high back chairs, and they form a room within a room. They kind of create this shelter. And then this light fixture at the top centers over the table and focuses all the light down on the table. Now what you have to remember is in 1889, when he built this house, there was not electricity in Oak Park. And he knew it was going to come because he was working on the auditorium building, which still exists in downtown Chicago. And he knew it would eventually come there. So when he built the house, he wired the entire house for electricity, knowing that it would come at some point. When it did come to Oak Park, all he had to do was flick a switch, and he's the first person in town with electric lights. So a few years later, by the time he does this dining room, most everybody who has means in Oak Park has electrics, and they may have a simple bulb or simple shade hanging down over their table. That wasn't good enough for him. So he did this elaborate fret-sun panel that had rice paper above it, and so the light glowed over the table. The other thing that he did here is we're starting to see his art glass develop. This is a lotus leaf pattern, and this bay comes across here. Originally, there was art glass in the lower bay. And when we do our walking tour, we'll see there's another house that was built after Wright did this that's really close to the edge of this house, because Wright was notorious for building up to his property line too. And he didn't like it. He didn't like the look of it, so he closed off all those lower windows so he didn't have to see his neighbor's house. Here we are upstairs, and I should put in a plan of the home and studio to give you a little context, but we are upstairs, and the room that we just saw is directly below where we're standing in this hallway. So this is the hallway looking into the playroom. This was built for his children. Here's looking into the playroom from a balcony up above. This is a barrel vault ceiling, and here again we have this fret-sun panel up here, and there's lights above this. It also has a skylight above it, so it's both the day and night light source. I'm going to go back to that one a little bit. I have another picture in another presentation. So this was all designed for his children. It was like a playroom we would have today, or a family room. It has brick as the interior of it. Everything's low. The seat is low. This is only 5 feet here to the top of the windows. So everything's scaled for a child, and for a child to be rough. And Anna, his wife, conducted kindergarten using those Froebel blocks for neighborhood children in this room. And this is where the Christmas tree was in the winter, and there was a piano off in the corner. Here's his family in 1890. At this point, he has one child, and he will eventually have 6 children with Anna. So this is Anna, and that's right. And he'll have 6 children, 2 girls and 4 boys. And he lives here in the house with Anna till 1909. This is in the studio space. This is in the entryway of the studio space. So this is his art glass. He did the studio in 1895, sorry. And by that time, he's really developing his art glass that he became very famous for. And so this is a lay light. It's in the ceiling of the entryway. And it has a skylight above it, and it has light bulbs there. So it's both day and night light source. This was hidden when they did the restoration, and they knew there had been a lay light there and that it was pretty elaborate. And so I know the people who were involved in the original restoration, and they said that it was really exciting when they opened it up and that skylight was still there. Just had to have minor repairs. There's over 1,000 pieces of leaded glass in there. And this is the drafting room with a large octagonal room on the top and a square room on the bottom. And the drafting room is held together with these chains. So the chains run around the octagon, and they act as a tension ring holding that roof into place. Because the roof, usually you have something to hold it in place because gravity and snow loads want to push that roof down. So he's using these chains as a tension ring. Not a new idea that was done in medieval cathedrals, but they didn't expose it. So Wright exposes it and then takes it a step level and farther, and he suspends the balcony from that chain link. This had all been floored over when they were doing the restoration, and one of my friends who was the architect and this was an apartment up here, he was poking in his ceiling at night and found the original chain harness. So it was very exciting for him. This is the lower level of the drafting room. And you can see that upper balcony, and again, that chain harness, how it would go around the octagon. If you get a chance, when they open up again, please go visit the home and studio. It's a tremendously beautiful space. So this is the Frank Lloyd Wright Historic District. And this is a map of Oak Park right here. It's bound by North Avenue, Roosevelt Road on the south, Harlem on the west, and Austin on the east. And in this little part right here is the Frank Lloyd Wright Historic District. Oak Park has the largest number of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in the world, and tourists come from all over the world to see the buildings here. So when Wright was doing his, he had built his house in Oak Park, and he was working for Sullivan, but he had a growing family and had a very elaborate taste for fine things. He was always short of money, so he did a series of what we call the bootleg houses, and these were built in Oak Park, LaGrange, and Chicago, and they were done for developers. They were spec houses. So this is one we'll see on our tour. It's a modified Queen Anne, and I'll go over a little bit later what a Queen Anne is. It's a modified Queen Anne, but Wright adds his own flourish to it. Here's another one of the bootleg houses. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, that's one of the bootleg houses. And then this was what we consider Wright's first independent design in 1893. So those bootleg houses, Wright was working on those, and Sullivan was taking a walk in Chicago and saw a house under construction and recognized Wright's design or Wright's style. Approached him with it. They had a huge fight. Wright left Sullivan's employment that day, and they didn't speak again until near the end of Sullivan's life. We're not sure that Wright ever paid him back, probably not, because Wright always owed people money. but he still, in spite of that, always considered Sullivan he called him mein Liebermeister, his mentor. And at the end of Sullivan's life, he was destitute. He had been one of the most famous architects in the world, and he was an alcoholic and destitute. And Wright did come to his aid financially, and they reestablished contact. So this is the Winslow House. This is in River Forest, Illinois. This looks like a modern house that could be built today. This was shocking to the neighbors. They had a central entrance, this big windows, and it was considered really revolutionary. In fact, the story is that Winslow had to take the alleys to the train because people would bug him about his house and they didn't like how it looked. It's a house that still today looks very modern. This just sold, I want to say sold for like $3 million a year or two ago. So the prairie houses are what we in Oak Park are most familiar with Wright for. So this is another house that we'll see on our walking tour. This is the Frank Thomas house. This is considered Wright's first prairie house. And the term prairie house didn't happen until later. There were a group of architects who were all doing very similar styles, and they had a collaborative in the Schiller building in downtown Chicago, and they called themselves the Chicago architects, or the Chicago style. There's also a Chicago style of architecture for high-rises. Wright coined the term prairie house in his autobiography that he wrote in the 20s. So it was not called a prairie house then. But the elements of the prairie house are long and low, a shallow hipped roof. You can see the chimney right here, big wide chimney. Rooms rotate around the chimney. Usually the ground level, there is no basement, and the ground level is much like we would have a basement today. It's where the utility rooms are. If there's what they would call a billiards room, which is like a family room, that would be down there. Maids' quarters would be down there, and then the living space would be up on the upper level. And this house, when we walk there, you'll see it has beautiful art glass. Very simple use of materials. He's only got wood, glass, and stucco on here. Not a lot of materials. And then you notice the windows are all banded together. They're a ribbon of windows. The other thing, and I think Leona had said this, is when you enter the space, okay, I know that this is an entrance. This is where I'm going to go. There's a wall. I'm supposed to go through this arch. And you think you may just go in straight and enter. But no, you enter through the arch, you turn to the left, you go up the stairs, then you turn to the right, and one panel is the door that you go through. So this is a Japanese approach to architecture, different than the bootleg houses that he did earlier. You do not put the entrance straight on. You have an approach to the house. One of the next houses that he did, prairie houses, very famous one, is the Dana Thomas house. So keep this in mind. This was the Dana Thomas house. Susan Lawrence Dana was a wealthy socialite. She wanted Frank Lloyd Wright to remodel her family home. This was her parents' house. And so she contracted him to come and remodel his parents' house, her parents' house. It's in Springfield, Illinois. And this is what she got. He totally engulfed the other house, took away all elements of it. If you take the tour, there is only one room that was her father's favorite room that was left like the original house. This is owned by the state of Illinois. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It is a stunningly beautiful house to go see. I've seen it 6-8 times, and I want to see it 6-8 times more. Here's the side view of it. Somewhere in this area I think in this area is the original house. But the roof, notice how the roof has like a pagoda shape, that influence of Japanese architecture, big wide chimney. That's kind of a giveaway for a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And beautiful terracotta panels. This is an influence from Sullivan. And it's got this great copper gutters and such. Here's an interior shot of the entrance. So you would come up these steps. The main entrance is right down here. You would come up the steps and you would come into the space. And the upstairs, you could peek out from these windows and see who was coming, see if you wanted to come down or not. This area back here over the entrance is where musicians would be during a party, and they would play for Susan and her guests. Every element of this house was designed by Wright. The rugs, the furniture. He chose all the artwork. He designed all the art glass and all the lamps. He chose the the sculptures. He designed the curtains. It's a completely intact Frank Lloyd Wright house. There's only a few pieces missing. This is the library. So this is off to the side. Susan Lawrence Dana had a large collection of books, and she wanted a library to loan out books to the children in the community. So this is the library. Again, we're seeing that barrel vault that we saw in his playroom. I'm going to go back. So this house, Susan lived here for only a few years, and then she became sick, and she ended up living in a hospital for many years, and it was closed up. And it was, I believe, in the late 30s, it went up for sale, all the interior furnishings and everything, and nobody wanted to buy any of it. One farmer bought 10 of the dining room chairs for $1 a piece. So she had passed away, and they sold the house, and there was a publishing company that bought the house and all the remaining contents. And they valued Wright's influence, and they kept everything intact. There were a few things missing, which they were able to purchase later. In the 80s, Jim Thompson, who was our governor in Illinois, wanted to buy this house. He wanted it to be a party house for all the politicians, and local architects convinced him that this was an important piece and it needed to be a historic house museum. So it was purchased. He negotiated buying pieces for the house that were missing at auction, and they restored the house, and it's open for tours by the state when things are open again. This is a beachy house. This is on Forest Avenue in Oak Park. We will see this again next Wednesday. This looks different than Wright's houses, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but this was 1906. This was actually designed by Walter Burley Griffin, who worked in Wright's office. And Walter Burley Griffin did a lot of houses. He did some in Elmhurst. He did a lot in Beverly, the neighborhood Beverly in Chicago. And then he ended up moving to Australia and doing the capital, Canberra in Australia. So the story is that he loaned Wright money to go to Japan in 1906, Wright's first trip to Japan, and Wright gave him the commission on this house. But because he worked for Wright, it's listed as a Frank Lloyd Wright house. And people who know Walter Burley Griffin know that this is his house. It's different. The windows look very different. We don't have the leaded glass, the way they're punctuated. We have a big plate glass window here and a lot more materials. This is definitely a Walter Burley Griffin house. And here's the inside of this house. The current owners are great stewards of this. They open it up for benefits all the time, and they have really restored it nicely. And this is the Roby House in Hyde Park. This was built in 1909. So Frank Lloyd Wright, as I said, had lived in Oak Park till 1909. 1909, he leaves the country with his lover, who was a client, the wife of one of his clients. And they'd been having an affair in Oak Park. Both their spouses knew about it, and they eventually left and went to Europe. He'd been asked to work on Wasmuth portfolios, of his work, and so he used it as an excuse, and he left with Mamah Bothwick Cheney. So the Cheney house in Oak Park, not the Cheney mansion, that's a little different. The Cheney house was her house that he designed for her, and they left. This was not finished when he left, and so Marion Mahoney helped to finish it, as did a couple other people, but Wright was instrumental in the design. This is on the campus of University of Chicago. Here's a historic photograph of it. Again, see these high back chairs, and these are light fixtures at the corner. And here is that ribbon of beautiful art glass doors or windows that open up. So again, he designed the carpet, all the furniture, all the lighting. This house just finished its major renovation, about $20 million, and finished it about 2 years ago, year and a half ago. So here's a detail of the art glass windows. The house is owned by the University of Chicago, but tours are given by the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio. I'm going back a few years. 1905 is when Wright did Unity Temple. And we already talked a little bit about Unity Temple, I think. So Unity Temple is in Oak Park. The previous church had burned to the ground a few blocks away, and Wright was a member of the congregation. So they asked him to design the new church. So this is the temple part, and this is the gathering part for the church, the social part. Notice the windows are way up high. You're not down low, and it doesn't look like a traditional church. This is Lake Street here, and it's just as noisy now as it was back in 1905. So he put the windows up high so you weren't bothered by the noisy Lake Street. And he built right to the property line here. Here's a photo of the interior. You enter low, and then you get glimpses of the whole space as you're coming in. I think I have another presentation with more pictures of this building, but you enter low and then you come into the larger space. There's no cross. Everybody's sitting in a U shape. This is at the minister's area right here. So he can see, actually the minister's right here. So he can see everybody in the whole space. There's seating down on the first level, first balcony, second balcony in a U shape. It can hold 400 people, but nobody's more than 40 feet from the minister's eyes. So he can see his entire congregation, and you can see other people in the congregation as you're sitting there. This is the Larkin building done in Buffalo, New York in 1904. This was torn down in the late 50s. Larkin was a soap manufacturing company, and this was the headquarters that Wright did for them. It was a revolutionary building. It had a central courtyard right here with skylights above, an open office area, and then there's offices along at the different levels. This was highly toted. It was torn because it used the same heating system as the rest of the manufacturing plants, but I don't know why they didn't tear down the warehouses. They tore this down, and I think there's great regret. I know there's great regret in Buffalo that they did. Here's an interior shot of those tables, and again, this is this big tall atrium along there. The next period of Wright's life is called the Lost Years. This is from 1910 to 1922. And after Wright left with Mamie Cheney, he tried to come back in 1910. Nobody wanted him. He was not welcome back in Oak Park. He had lost most of his clients. His mother gave him land up in Spring Green at the family farm, and he built his house Taliesin up there. But he was considered washed out at this point in time. People thought he was done for. So here's Mamie Bothwell Cheney, his lover who he went to Europe with. Her husband gave her a divorce, but Wright's wife, Anna, would not give him a divorce. So this is the Wasmans portfolio that they had gone to Europe to do, and it was a collection of Wright's drawings, and here's some of them. That's the Larkin building that we just saw. And this one is the Hertley house that we'll see on our walk. And it looks very similar to a lot of the Japanese drawings that we saw earlier. 1912, he did do the Coonley Playhouse. He had done the Coonley Mansion in Riverside, so he did the Coonley Playhouse in 1912. That's one of the few commissions that he had in the area during that period of time. And he has these beautiful art glass windows with these colored bubbles or balls on it. If you've ever been to the Art Institute and gone up as you enter, right as you enter, go up to the second floor, and there's all these artifacts from buildings, most of which have unfortunately been torn down, hanging up there, and there are windows from the Coonley Playhouse. Coonley Playhouse is still around, and you could have bought it recently, but the windows are in the Art Institute, the original ones. They've recreated the ones there. So here's the windows, and you can see one of them has an American flag. It's not one of these. So here's Taliesin East that he built up in Spring Green, Wisconsin. He built it in 1911. It says till 1959 because that's the last year that Wright was there. So they stopped changing things after Wright left. They're just trying to maintain it. This house burned to the ground twice, and Wright had to rebuild it. So here's a picture of the interior. Pretty big, wide open space. So in 1914 to 1929, Wright is working on the Midway Gardens in Chicago. And in 1923, in 1923, let me just check something here. I'll just go through this. In 1913, there was a tragedy, but he was working on the Midway Gardens, and this was a beer garden in Chicago. Big beer garden, like you would see in Germany and Europe. These are called sprites. These were designed by an artist named Alfonso Iannelli. and they decorated the beer garden all around. And you can see pictures of this. Here's a picture of one of the interior spaces. And another picture of an interior space. And again, this looks a lot like that Coonley Playhouse. He's starting to do a lot of circles. That's why when, Leona, when you said he did mainly rectangular things, I'm like, not necessarily. So in 1913, when he was working on this building, Mamah Chaney was up at the brand new Taliesin up in Spring Green, Wisconsin. Go back to that picture. So she was up at Taliesin, and she was there with her 2 children. She had been divorced from her husband, and a few guests. One of the servants, they have no idea why, went crazy. He started fires. He locked all the entrances to the rooms. He'd served everybody lunch, then locked all the entrances to the rooms except one, started a fire, and as people came out, the only way to get out of the building, he had hacked them to death with an axe. So people were saying this was Wright's punishment for his affair with Mamah Chaney. You know, it wasn't well looked upon. When he actually left Europe with Mamah Chaney, it made the front pages of most every newspaper in the country because it was just scandalous. But it didn't punish Wright. Wright was fine. It punished everybody who was part of him. So that house burned to the ground. He went up. He actually took the train up, got a telegram that the house had burned to the ground and people were killed, and had to take a 3-hour train ride to get up there. On the same train in the same car was Mamah's ex-husband, which was probably interesting. He went up. He gathered his 2 dead children to bring back to Oak Park to bury, and Wright buried Mamah Chaney at the family cemetery in right down the road from his house. He then rebuilt the house. It burned from a fire again a few years later, and he rebuilt it again. So up from the ashes. In 1916, Wright was asked to build the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. Oh, does anybody? So the Midway Gardens went till 1929. Only 15 years. Prohibition hit in 1929. So a beer garden couldn't make it because they weren't allowed to sell beer. And to make it as any other venue as a tea garden, it wouldn't make enough money. Imperial Hotel in Tokyo was built in 1916 to 1922, and had this big pond in the front and beautiful interior spaces. It was torn down in the 60s for kind of an ugly hotel, but soon after it was built, there was a large earthquake in Tokyo. Many buildings were lost. And there's a famous telegram that Wright says he received saying that his building stayed and it didn't fall down. And but there's questions whether Wright sent that telegram to himself or not. But the building did stay intact. He had used a series of interlocking logs and created a floating foundation. And if you've ever played with Lincoln Logs, his son John Lloyd Wright was there working on the Imperial Hotel with him and came back and invented the toy Lincoln Log based on that experience working on the hotel. The only thing left of the hotel is the original lobby and bar. So we were in Japan a few years ago when my son was living there, and we all went there and had a drink. I was sure it was going to be crowded, so we got there right when they opened, but it wasn't that crowded. But it was really fun to be in that space. This is the Hollyhock House in 1917 to 1920. This is for Barnsdale was the woman's name, and Edith Barnswell, and she wanted this house. She was into the arts. So this is starting to have a lot of the look of South American or Native American architecture, or like Inca architecture. Here's the interior of the space. Wright made the cover of Time magazine more than once. Then his last part was called The Later Years. It was 1923 to 1959. During that time, in 1932, he was married to his third wife. So Anna had divorced him. He had a short marriage with another woman, and then he married, and why am I spacing out her name? He married his third wife, Olga Vanna. And Olga Vanna convinced him to write his autobiography and to create a school up at Taliesin where students paid him to go to school, and they also had to work on the farm, grow all the vegetables, cook. So they had to do everything, and he would teach them everything he knew. So this is students working on Broadacre City, which was his plan for development. Here's a picture of Broadacre City. And this model would travel around, and if he had done his model, it's really kind of spread out. But look at this picture that he's drawing in 1929. He's got these hovercrafts over there, and the cars are really futuristic. So this was his vision of a future living area. Everybody had their own property. They grew their own vegetables. And remember this building right here, because this will come up in one of the later buildings that he does. Here's another picture of Broadacre City. You'd have high rises, and then you have farms. It really was auto-dependent. In 1935, he's asked by Edgar Kaufman to do Falling Water, which is outside of Pittsburgh. Edgar Kaufman owned a big department store in Pittsburgh, and they had this land and this beautiful waterfall. And when Wright asked them what they liked about the land, they said, oh, we love to sit on this rock right here and enjoy the waterfall. So he built the house over the water. Here's a picture of the inside. And this stayed in the Kaufman family. Their son lived there, and then he donated it to the Pennsylvania Conservancy along with the land, and it's now a historic museum, and it's preserved forever. This is a pathway up to the guest house. This is concrete, folded panels. And here's Falling Water in the winter. So if you're ever in Pittsburgh, go to Falling Water. Even though they can't be in the house right now, they're doing outside tours, which are stunningly beautiful also. So in 1935, Wright's got his school going in Wisconsin, and he has these students there, but he's tiring of the cold Wisconsin winters. So he goes down one winter to near Scottsdale and decides he likes this area. So he ends up buying some property and eventually building a house. And so they would commute. The students, they would do this caravan from Spring Green to Scottsdale go down there every fall and come back every spring. So they were in the South in the winter and up in Wisconsin in the summer. So this is Taliesin West. This is also a historic museum. Here's another picture of it. Original panels were tensioned canvas. So you can see the canvas lets the light in. He designed all of the furniture in here. And here it is at night. A little deceiving. I went there a few years ago and we got to have dinner with a group up at night on there, and when it was built, it was out in the middle of nowhere, and now the suburbs come like right up to the driveway, so it's not quite the same. In 1936, he's approached to do Johnson Wax by, why am I spacing on names today? And this is in Racine, Wisconsin. Johnson Wax is the Johnson Wax company that makes a lot of products that you probably use. They still use the exhibition building for some purposes, but there's free tours every Friday, and they're really nice tours. When we get out of this, we're going to take the architecture club up there and do the tours. So when he designed this, he has these pedestals, and he suspended the whole roof structure. So this is where the cars would park, and then you'd walk across to the administration building. And then here's the reception room, and these are all lucite tubes that let light in from the top into the space. And here's the whole space. So these are pedestals that support up the roof structure, and in between them are these lucite tubes that act as skylights, and they come down to a very thin point at the bottom. Some people say they look like golf tees, lily pads, martini glasses. You know, there's lots of things. When he was proposing this, the building department did not feel that it would stand up. So they made him do a test column, and he loaded it more than double its required weight, and it still didn't fail. Apparently he was standing there when they were loading sandbags onto it, and it was a big deal because everyone thought for sure this thing's going to fall down and crash. and he would go over periodically. He wore a big long cape and had a big fedora, and it had a cane, and he would go over and whack the bottom of the column occasionally, just to show him he wasn't afraid of it. So this was all the offices for Johnson Wax. And here's a more current picture. The furniture was all designed by Wright and built by a brand new company at the time called Steelcase. And so Steelcase built the furniture. It was their first big contract, and they have been very supportive of Wright's work and preserving Wright's work even today. So if you Steelcase is most of the office furniture that you're sitting in if you're in a corporate office. This is the connection to the research tower. It's this lucite walkway. And here's the research tower. This was only used for a couple of years. They now have rehabbed these two floors right here. So one's a balcony, and they've recreated what the original research lab would have been. But there was only one narrow stair up, one narrow elevator, and only a men's bathroom, because women didn't do that stuff. In Wright's later years, he develops what he calls Usonian houses. He's using the term United States of America, and he developed these houses as simple, inexpensive houses for the average person. So this is the Jacobs 1 house in 1936. He ended up doing 2 houses for the Jacobs. They asked him to do another one later, a little bit bigger. And it's got this curved, this is the Jacobs 2 house. This one is more of a passive house. So here's the Jacobs 2 house. The back end is buried. This is all south facing, and the bedrooms all face out over this balcony over the lower level. And here's a cutaway of it. So the bedrooms have high windows. Everything's bermed on the north side, which is the colder side. The sun comes in. So this is long before people were doing passive houses. He has a concrete slab to absorb all that heat, a sunken garden. This is the Pope Leahy house. My husband and I saw this last summer. This was moved to in Virginia, and because it had been in a floodplain. So this is one of the houses, and they're pretty tiny houses. This is the David Wright house. This just recently sold. This was done for his son in 1950. So he did a number of these houses, these Usonian houses, but this is probably the most unique one. Here again is the David Wright house. Custom designed carpet. And the Guggenheim Museum, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. This is in New York. It was the Museum for Contemporary Art. And Wright worked on this, never saw it completed. He died before it was finished. Here's the inside. You would take the elevator up, and then you would snake down this spiral to the bottom, and you could always see the bottom area. People think you start at the bottom and go to the top. It's exact opposite. The big problem is he has this continuous curved wall, like a shell or a snail shell, and artwork isn't curved like that. So they've ended up having to put flat panels in there, so it's faceted on the inside now. And here's looking up at the skylight. So Frank Lloyd Wright dies in 1957. And remember, he had designed over 1,000 works. He had completed 500 and some. And he dies in 1957, but his stuff keeps getting built. Remember I said, remember the arches in that one futuristic Broadacre City drawing? Here, that looks very similar to what we've got here. This was built designed for Madison, Wisconsin, never built. It was built in 1992. It's a convention center. It's actually pretty nice. It's on their lake. This is a house that was designed to go out over the water. This was built between 2004 and 2007. So 2007, he's been dead for 50 years, and they're building his designs. Kind of unheard of. This is the Sky Mausoleum. I did not show houses from in Buffalo, the Martin House Complex. But the Martin House Complex, Martin was the treasurer for the Larkin building, where they did the large Larkin building, and he was a great supporter of Wright, always loaning him money, always giving him money. And he did not, he died after the Depression and had no money. This was designed by Wright for him, but never got built. So it was built by a group, money was raised by volunteers, and it was built in 2004. So that's Darwin Martin's grave. The Fontana Boathouse, this is in Buffalo, New York also. Buffalo has great architecture if you want a good place to go visit. And you can go to Niagara Falls too. So this is for rowing, boat rowing. Here it is during the daytime. This is a beautiful building. And then there's a gas station that he designed. This was built in a museum. So this was a gas station that he had designed, built in 2014. So here he is looking at the model of the Guggenheim Museum, which he fought hard to get built, but he never saw it completed. So that's the end of my Wright thing. I could talk to you for hours about Wright. There are dozens and dozens of books written about him, and I would encourage you to open them up and look at them. This is just touching so briefly, and there's so many things that I didn't put in, but we'd go on for 2 hours.